We're out here in the garden today and observing some pretty significant rabbit browse that's starting to pick up like crazy. Now that we're getting a little more snow, the nights are getting colder, the wild rabbits that generally stay out in the hedgerows, stay in the wild spaces, are pushing harder and harder into the garden. We need to do something. As a nursery, we can't just have all of our plants disappear. But what we also can't do ethically is to use poisons or to use traps. Maybe we hunt them, but maybe there's a better solution where we can actually obtain a valuable yield while the rabbits can have a nice life for the winter. So we're going to explore that today. Having a thin blanket, fresh blanket of snow is really informative as far as who's moving through the garden. And we can see very clearly that there is just a huge amount of traffic, almost traffic jams of rabbits moving through this space. And it makes perfect sense. They've gone through and started eating the tops off of some kales and cabbages. I don't think even with a fair bit of damage that the rabbits would kill every last bit, but each one of these wounds that they put on the plant makes them more susceptible to winter damage. So we could call it a test of whether or not they're not only winter hardy but also rabbit proof, but they're not. So we need to protect these plants somehow. One thing that I've definitely learned pretty definitively over 10 or 15 years of watching rabbits through the winters, once they start working on a space, they just keep going through the entire winter. As soon as it turns green in the spring and it warms up, the pressure generally dissipates. They'd rather stay on the edges, but we can anticipate this just getting worse and worse and worse if we don't intervene. In fact, even though we haven't even hit the coldest time of year, seeing the rabbits begin to eat the tops of these perennial leeks is very telling. They're on the way to eating things even that they don't normally like, so we could expect by spring, with no intervention, most of our nursery stock would be damaged. That's rough. We can certainly use scrap sections of fencing to protect some things. So for example, in here we've got some healed in hazelnuts as well as some goji berries, and that'll do a pretty decent job of keeping rabbits out. But we don't have enough of that fencing. We've just got plants in so many different areas, and I know we could go around and try to reinforce the fence around the entire perimeter. That would be hundreds of dollars, tons more metal, and if there's even the tiniest crack in the fencing, they're still coming in. So how do we keep them closer to where they live, satisfied and satiated, and maybe generating some fertility in those areas that we could then plant out later? Let's explore that. I think the key is in my hand right here. This is a random branch from an apple tree, and we have lots of grafted apples. In fact, apple trees that we've grafted on wild rootstock. These are crab apple rootstocks that we've grafted cider apples and keeping apples on, but they're so dense we need to prune them every year anyway. And probably the very top part, the list of plants that rabbits would want to eat, are the buds and the thin bark on growing wood of apples. They'd never have access to this from the ground, but if we can put this where they live, that might keep them where they live and not in our garden. We have a number of contexts like what's right behind us. These are brush walls that we've laid up on our property line. Incredibly nice habitat for rabbits. And I've seen rabbits in the garden running back towards this space. And when we see a fair bit of snow, a lot of times there are tracks coming in and out. So the key, I think, is to start by taking apple branches that we need to prune anyway and chopping them up so that they lay low enough that the rabbits have access. There's actually a fair bit of food in that because they'll go through and chew the tips and all of the bark along these branches. And so if we can find where their holes are and feed them right there, it's a shorter commute for them and less likelihood that they're going to come into the garden. So we're on the outside of the garden here, and I noticed, although I walked all over them before we filmed in here, but a fair number of rabbit tracks that are coming from over in the woods and maybe from under our neighbor's shed that are moving this way. They go along through here and then they go into our garden. And so not only can we put these branches out to feed them, but we can also strategically put the branches where we want their fertility, where we want their manure. So for example, we've got black currants that are growing here. We don't have to worry about rabbits browsing on black currants. At least I've never seen them ever eat blackcurrant branches. But if there's a whole lot of rabbit food near them, the rabbits can eat the apple branches that we needed to prune anyway, and inevitably they're going to leave a whole bunch of manure in exchange. And if all of this is happening outside of the garden, and they can be fully fed from one of their favorite foods without having to risk pushing into our garden, we get less browse in there. It's pretty important to be really clear about this. Putting some apple branches outside of the garden when there's lots of rabbit browse inside the garden, I'm not suggesting that we've found the perfect solution and that just by laying some branches once or twice in January, there's no more issues. We still have to figure out what does it look like putting small sections of fencing around the highest value plants we have in there. We'll need to think about when we get heavy snows, renewing these sticks in new areas that are on the paths that the rabbits take anyway. We need to keep a backup plan idea. Maybe I do need to think about hunting a little bit here or there and reducing their numbers, hoping that we see some predators come into the scene. The challenge with hunting, we do eat meat, but I don't know that I want to be standing out here with a pellet gun at 3 in the morning on a 15-degree night. So it's little gestures like this that move things in the right direction. They're part of a complex, rich set of strategies, and it's just something to consider. We'll share an honest update about how this works in the next few days to weeks or so, give you some imagery of what the rabbits are doing to these branches once they find them. I've tried this in the past. In fact, it was one of the first videos that I put out almost 10 years ago. I'll link to it here, where I used branches of apple trees to focus fertility where we wanted new gardens, and it worked incredibly well at the time. So it's a passive and gentle way to move in the direction of distracting rabbits from getting into our garden while we still keep a close eye on what they are actually doing and think through some other strategies. We'd love to hear from you. Do you have some ideas on gentle and thoughtful and ecologically balanced ways that you can manage rabbits in your gardens in the winter? Thanks for watching.